My name is Paul Chalmers and I am the chair of the New Zealand Fabian Society, and I'd like to acknowledge my fellow Fabians here, Phil Harrington and Ryan and Linda and others that are part of the Fabian Society. And we're dedicated to socialism as quick as possible. There's actually socialism as slowly as possible, but yeah, it's a socialist think tank that we hope to promote, socialist ideas and views, yeah, that's the Fabians. This is a very special moment for me because I'm able to introduce Ryan, and I'd like to introduce Ryan by just introducing the picture on the wall. The picture on the wall is by Bodie Friend. Now, if you know your rugby league history, Friend is a name that is synonymous with a gritty little halfback who was in my fourth form class in 1975. He's in the photo on a couple of occasions. And so the Friend family, I think it's a wonderful depiction of rugby league whānau. And these are some of the people I played against when I played rugby league and was coached by Cameron. You can see Cameron's in a number of photos. He was a fearsome rugby league player. His son Ian is sitting on the second row, second from right, was the captain of the Auckland team when they beat the Aussies. It was a fantastic game at Carlo Park. And so as an introduction to the wide world of rugby league, the wonderful artwork of Bodie Friend, but remembering his rugby league heritage and the importance of rugby league to Māori families in New Zealand, but also the wider family movement. I'd like to introduce Ryan very quickly. I didn't know Ryan until my daughter said, "Have you read this book on rugby league?" No. To be honest, I find sports biographies, sports histories. I read a recent one on the rugby Springbok tour of 1920 by a Labour Party person. It was very good, I thought, but not in the. Ryan's book is just a masterpiece of the history of class politics in New Zealand, more than anything else, class and race, and it takes apart some of the myths that we have about ourselves as a country, but also our sporting heroes, our so-called sporting heroes. I had a falling out with rugby when I was trialling out for Manukau Rovers, and had been and ended up on the right side in the Springbok tour with a number of issues that I had with the rugby union. And Ryan's book just clarified it for me, why I was doing the things that I was being arrested for, and put rugby in its place. And I still, sort of try and watch rugby. And I've it's just Ron Don and his appalling slavering to the white racist South Africans was, in that period, something that was traumatic, very traumatic. And New Zealanders never got over it, and we are now, hopefully, turning the corner on race politics until we had the recent election. So this book is very, very topical. It is deeply researched, and it has Olsen Filipina in it, who frightened the hell out of me, and I'm going to introduce Ryan now to take you through. Two other guests, obviously, sorry. On my left, I've got Karl Anderson, who was a talent at rugby league. You were bloody good. Yeah, and who was coached by his dad, I think. For a while, yeah. And son of Bill, and is a staunch union rugby league guy. And on my right, Mark Gosche, my mate, ex-chair of New Zealand Rugby League. No, on the board. Sorry, I elevated him. I elevate, chairs on the board of New Zealand Rugby League. A fantastic rugby league player himself, and a very, very, as we all know, a strong unionist and a Labour Party parliamentarian. So I'd like to introduce Ryan to the audience.
Tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Ngā mihi nui ki a koutou katoa. Ki te atua, tēnā koe. Kia papa tuanoku, tēnā koe. kia tangata whenua, Ngāti Whātua Rākei, Māori ora. Ko kaimahi Pākehā te iwi, no tauranga moana ahau, ko Ryan Bodman, toku ingoa. Tūhia ki te rangi, tūhia ki te whenua, tūhia ki te ngākau o ngā tangata ko te mea nui ko te aroha, ti hei Māori ora. Tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. So I'm just going to speak briefly about the process of me coming to write this book, and then just read a couple of sections, and then move on to let Karl and Mark say a few words, and then hopefully we can have a bit of a chat, because I did spend a lot of time reading and researching this, but it's rugby league from a particular perspective, and my experience of rugby league is primarily as a consumer as opposed to a participant, and so I'm aware that I'm an outsider from certain perspectives of the story, so I don't want to take up too much space from the people who have actually run the ball up. But yeah, I'll say a few things about how I got into this project, and then move on. We can chat more, and other speakers can get say their words. So it was speaking to Mark and Karl actually, and other trade unionists, that got me interested in this topic, interviewing them for a oral history, there was an oral history component of a history of trade unions in New Zealand in the post-war period, and speaking to people like Mark and Karl, and just seeing how much the social movement of the trade union movement was in certain places very interconnected with the rugby league scene. That just sparked my interest, and then at university there's very much a strong mythology there, but through the state mechanism and the universities across the countries where rugby union has been really intertwined with the egalitarian mythology of the country, and so that always stunk to me. From my experience, so like I knew that there were, like, Joe Blow played the game, but it was very evident that it was most powerful where all the fancy schools are. So that was a myth that stunk to me immediately. So I was interested when I started to see rugby league as potentially telling a counterpoint to that story. Certain aspects of the project that really maintained my interest throughout were the very clear class dynamics that played out between rugby league and rugby union early in the 20th century, where the issue of player payment was what split the games, and so at certain moments the unfairness of the expectations that the rugby union had upon footballers came to a head, and that's what either led to the establishment of or the surge of rugby league in those early periods, and very strong class dynamics to that. The strong place of women, the very strong role that women have played in the game's social life, dating back to the 1930s, was fascinating to me, in that, it was a counterpoint to the elements of the gender dynamic that is assumed as the norm, because history casts the middle class gaze onto the past, and so middle class norms are often the assumed norm, and so to see, which was my experience too, that women in working class backgrounds very, very seldom stood in the background in terms of the social life of the space. It was reminding me of my nan, to be honest. She was just Labour class, like Labour Party Methodist, so I was just like, fuck, that's mean. I'll look at that a bit more. And also the game's ongoing ability to represent the people and to galvanise them into a force. I think you can see that all the time with Mati Maa Tonga or Up the Wires. It speaks to people. It's a space where it brings people who feel on the outside in, I think. But anyway, I'm just going to, for those who haven't engaged with the book, I'm just going to read an opening section so you get a sense of the vibe. And then I might read another section from further on that sort of speaks a bit more to elements of the Fabians' interests. So in the lead up to the 2011 Rugby World Cup, my friend Matt Ross was a teacher at Maniraua's James Cook High School. Matt vividly remembered the All Blacks' victory at the inaugural Rugby World Cup in 1987, and like many other New Zealanders, was hoping that 2011 would be the year that the All Blacks finally repeated that feat. A couple of months out from the event, and with anticipation brewing, Matt asked some of his students if they thought the All Blacks could overcome their World Cup bogey and claim the title of Rugby World Champions. In response, his students shrugged their shoulders or remained quiet, as if they had never given the topic much thought. When a student did speak, she changed the subject, asking Matt if he thought New South Wales would win Game 3 of the State of Origin series and bring Queensland's recent dominance to an end. On this occasion, Matt fell silent as the students erupted into discussion. In New Zealand, rugby league has always played second fiddle to rugby union on the national stage. But in pockets of the country, Māoridīwa included, rugby league is the dominant football code. There's about 20 rugby teams in Māoridīwa and 50 rugby league teams, explained Alan Johnson, life member of the Māoridīwa Marlins Rugby League Club. So the dominant idea that you hear on TV that rugby union is a national game is bullshit. It's not our national game around here. Speaking to Matt's experience, Johnson added, what's tending to happen in South Auckland in terms of sport is that the biggest nights of the year isn't when the All Blacks play Australia for the Bledisloe, it's state of origin. Rugby league has got such a dominance culturally. I mean, it's a cultural phenomenon. Rugby league in New Zealand, the people's history explores the cultural phenomenon that is rugby league in this country. On the game's introduction to New Zealand in 1907, rugby league was the target of sustained antagonism from rugby unions governing bodies. Seeking to defend the amateur ideals of their game, rugby union administrators actively undermined the growth of the fledgling code, as reported by the Evening Post on 17 May 1911. There is strong feeling in football circles regarding the rival games, and every effort is being made by the union to hinder the development of the league, end quote. To this end, the New Zealand Rugby Union issued dozens of life bans to footballers who switched codes and played rugby league prior to the First World War. During the same period, rugby's local governing bodies actively blocked rugby league from establishing a presence in state schools, a campaign maintained by overzealous school staff for decades. And rugby league administrators long struggled to gain equitable access to publicly owned sports facilities. According to John O'Lee, this official hostility towards the code initially went all the way to the top of government circles. It was only after Gordon Coates took over as Prime Minister in 1925 that the government ban against entertaining visiting league teams was lifted, Lee recalled in 1972. Until then, Mr. Sam Dixon, MP for Parnell, and I entertained them. As a result of this hostility from rugby union administrators and the game's influential allies, rugby league was forced to the margins of New Zealand society, where the code developed a unique place in the country's social and cultural landscape. Rugby league established a reputation as a working man's game, as the sport evolved into the dominant football code in numerous pockets of the country with a distinct working class character. The game was traditionally popular amongst wharfies. Jerry Evans recalled that out of over 1,700 watersiders in 1964, there were only 8 of us playing rugby in Auckland, while the Trade Unions League team could field 11 internationals. As in England and Australia, rugby league established deep connections with many of New Zealand's coal mining communities, and similarly strong relationships developed between the game and the freezing workers up and down the country. By the post-war period, rugby league was the dominant football code amongst workers at the Gearmeat, Southdown, Westfield, Tormona, Moerewa and Islington works. And as Robert Dunn recalled, Robert Dunn was just one of my neighbours who I wanted to put in my book, there was always plenty of white gummies at Carlaw. He's a hard case dude. Alongside the industrial working class, several other communities marginalised from mainstream Pākehā society developed enduring connections to this game of rugby league. During the game's early years, Kingitanga Māori established deep and lasting associations with the code in and around Rahui Pōkeka, Huntly and Ngāroa Wahia, and there was a significant influx of Māori footballers into rugby league during the 1930s after the NZRU imposed a colour bar upon All Black tours of South Africa. Following the First World War, the sectarian prejudice that permeated mainstream New Zealand occasionally found expression in provincial rugby unions, prompting some Irish Catholic communities to embrace rugby league. And in the decades following the Second World War, many of the Pacific peoples who settled in industrial towns and working class suburbs across the country developed strong connections with the sport. As patched gangs established a presence on New Zealand streets in the final decades of the 20th century, many of their members also came to exhibit a staunch preference for rugby league. This book explores the relationships that developed between rugby league and a number of diverse communities across New Zealand during the 20th century. It places those connections in their cultural and political contexts and explores traditions and heritage that developed around rugby league on these shores. In addition, rugby league in New Zealand, a people's history, puts the sport into its broader social context, charting rugby league's development through to the 21st century. This book details the game's fraught relationship with rugby union, seeks to explain the consolidation of rugby league as the dominant football code in several parts of the country, and tracks rugby league's transformation from a grassroots and essentially amateur game into a highly commercialised mass spectator sport in the context of the economic, social and political changes that have shaped modern day New Zealand. So that's sort of a rundown of what the book's about, broad overview. I'm going to flick to the section about the post-war period now. I'm just going to read the opening section of that, which sort of tries to draw the connections between the game and the broader social world of post-war New Zealand, I guess. So you still all with me? So this chapter is chapter 3. It opens with a quote from Dwayne Mann, who was in the opening season of the Warriors, which was a big deal when I was a kid. There is a distinct rugby league culture and psyche. It's grassroots, it's blue collar, and that's the attraction for down-to-earth, salt-of-the-earth people. The decades following the Second World War were something of a golden era for working-class New Zealand. The war cast a long shadow on society, but the deprivations that had been part of working-class life in the 1930s were increasingly confined to the past. As successive post-war governments prioritised full employment and maintained legislation introduced in 1936 by the first Labour government that enshrined the 40-hour week into law. Combined with a buoyant post-war economy, these policies extended relative economic security and unprecedented leisure time to working-class New Zealanders. The public's involvement in organised sport increased significantly at this time, and rugby league retained its close association with parts of working-class New Zealand. Reflecting on the game's popularity in the Grey Valley in 1947, John A. Lee wrote that they take their football seriously down there. They play league as work and they hew coal as a pastime. In the immediate post-war period, the mines and mills in and around the Grey Valley continued to employ many hundreds of young men, and towns like Blackpool, Ngāhere, Brunner and Runanga dominated the local football scene. The football here was pretty tough, said Les Nelson. The guys weren't trained in gym. Most of them were in real heavy industrial work. They were in the mine shoveling all day, and it was pretty hard work. You got pretty big shoulders. And the guys in the mills and the bush were the same. They were rugged, powerful men up top mostly, so the football they played was a pretty rugged game. This ruggedness translated into success on the football field. Between 1946 and 1950, the West Coast representative side defeated their Auckland counterparts in 4 of their 5 meetings. And in 1951, the Black Bull senior team travelled to Auckland and defeated Mount Albert to claim the recently established National Club Championship. Yet shortly after they returned home, as Peter Kerridge explained, Black Bull were defeated by their arch rivals, Ngāhere. So you had these 2 tiny little communities on either side of the Grey, both claiming to be national champions. Depends where you lived, I guess. It was a cold, drizzly afternoon in the winter of 1946, however, that is generally held to be the West Coast's finest rugby league hour. As one chronicler put it, on 29 July 1946, after a night of heavy rain, 13 gallant coasters strode out on Victoria Park, Greymouth, and humbled Great Britain's mighty Lions, fresh from their Ashes-winning tour of Australia. A couple of weeks after their 17-8 upset loss on the coast, the Lions were in Auckland, where they met the local provincial team at Carlo Park. The Auckland side featured a number of local watersiders, including Les Pye, Des Ryan, and Warwick Clark, and so the Waterside Workers' Union requested leave for all wharfies on the afternoon of the match. The request was declined by the Waterfront Control Commission, prompting a number of wharfies to take matters into their own hands. And so, as the Herald reported on 13 August 1946, 130 waterside workers just discharging a southern produce cargo from the Union Steamship Company vessel Waiana at Queen's Wharf left the ship at 3 o'clock yesterday afternoon to attend the rugby league match between England and Australia at Carlo Park. No further work was done on the ship until 6 o'clock, when the men returned to work for the evening shift. While the wharfies would have returned to work disappointed at Auckland's 22-9 loss to Great Britain, their decision to down tools and attend the match illustrates rugby league's enduring appeal on the waterfront. During the post-war years, wharfies in Wellington and New Plymouth had their own footy clubs. Interport rugby league tournaments were held across New Zealand. Representative wharfie teams played against their counterparts in Sydney. And in Auckland, rugby league was a major component of the waterfront's workplace culture. I quickly learnt that it was a New Zealand myth that rugby union was a workers' game, wrote the Welsh-born rugby player and trade unionist Jerry Evans. It might have been in the back blocks, but in Auckland, most Māoris, Polynesians and blue-collar workers played league. The association between rugby league and the waterfront was mirrored by the sport's popularity in the nation's freezing works. Roy Christian recalled that there used to be a joke that if you wanted to play for Otahu, you had to work at the freezing works or at the wharf. This connection had emerged in earlier decades, when clubs like Petone, Waitara, Hornby and Otahu established strong associations with local freezing works. Throughout the post-war period, this connection continued to grow, and rugby league became an important aspect of freezing worker culture in a number of New Zealand sheds. There was a hell of a lot of league players at the freezing works in those days, recalled Mark's late brother Peter. There was leagueies spread all over each department and in each works, and we used to have South Down Westfield tournaments that was held every year. Rugby league, there was never any rugby. So I'll finish there for now. That's just a little reading from the book, just setting the scene about what the book's about, and also hopefully what we're going to talk a bit more about now in relation to what these two gentlemen, their experiences in the game, and many of the things that got me interested in it in the first place. So thanks for listening.
Thank you, Ryan. Mark, can I ask you Karl, can I ask you to lead off with your reflections on the book?
Well, hello everyone. The first thing I have to say is I haven't read it yet. I was one of the first people to buy one, but since I retired from work about 7 or 8 years ago, after a lifetime of reading health and safety legislation and industrial laws and all sorts of other crap, I was never a social reader, but since I've retired, I've become a prolific social reader. So I've got a list of books, and this one's in it. So one of the first to purchase it, but I haven't read it yet. But I pretty much know what's in it, and I played a very minor role, in helping Ryan a little bit with bits and pieces. But look, I just perhaps reflect back to my own time in rugby league and politics and unions and everything else. And as some people may know here, my late father was Bill, so I came from a union family, and I grew up in Glen Innes, and I was born, of course, right in the middle of the waterfront lockout in 1951. And my mum, who's 100 years old and is still living, reminds me that we lived on silver beet in those days. So I started life as a vegetarian because they couldn't get any meat. So it didn't do me too much harm. And I grew up in Glen Innes, as we now, a GI boy, as we say, and rugby league in Glen Innes was big. But the club I played for was called City Newton. So there was City Newton Town, it was mainly Pacific Islanders, and there was City Newton GI, who were Maori and Pākehā. And when we played each other, it was hell to play. We used to have brawls, if we played at Victoria Park. But growing up in that area, which was it was a rugby league area, so there was City Newton GI, there was Mount Wellington was close, Otahu was fairly close too, and Ellerslie, and I went to school at Tamaki College, and at that stage I played rugby league for City Newton, and I can recall a time at Tamaki College when there was pressure on us kids to play for the first 15, because in those days the first 15 was everything. That was a lot of prestige, and I think that's still around now with the first 15s at schools, and you hear all sorts of horrendous stories about poaching young kids to go to that school and whatever. But I can recall a particular weekend there where I got called up at the main assembly on a Monday morning, and Tamaki College had a huge auditorium, big hall, and I was told to stand up, and I was publicly castigated for being disloyal and for playing rugby league for my club and refusing to play for the first 15. And later on in the day, of course, I got called to Mr. McDonald's office for corporal punishment for refusing to play for the first 15. And when I was 15, I probably wasn't much smaller than I am now. I was quite a big kid for my age, so McDonald told me to get my trousers down because I was going to get whacked. And I grabbed him by the throat held him up against the wall and said, "You're not." And off I went. So next thing you know, my dad's been rung up and he's down there and I'm down there. And when my dad heard the story, I think Mr. McDonald was lucky to be on his feet when he got the story. But that was what happened in those days, is that rugby union was everything. And I mean, in those days and still now, I don't subscribe to the theory that one's better than the other. I have a preference for rugby league, but I don't have any issues with rugby union. But there was that difference. And I can recall in those days, you know, part of City Newton, of course, was what they used to call Boot Hill, Kirimaina Street, Bastion Point. And they were all City Newton kids. And we actually had a little club room up there, up at what they themselves called Boot Hill. And so there was all those links there, and of course with the occupation in the end and the green ban and whatever, and it's part of rugby league, that whole setup. I can recall when we were, our club rooms at City Newton used to be in Victoria Park. It used to be called the Old Tin Shed. And, you know, if you weren't a union member there, then you couldn't play for the club. It was full of union people. And I mean, Ryan alluded to some of the gang participations, and it's a bit light-hearted this, but there was a point in time when I was playing senior rugby league for City Newton that there was the president of Hell's Angels played for us, the president and the secretary of Highway 61, the King Cobras, all the gangs were represented, but every union was represented too. And that was City Newton for you in those days. Yeah, there's been a strong link. I mean, I think that at the start, Ryan, wasn't the book going to be called Unions and Politics?
That was the initial focus.
It was, yeah, yeah. And, you know, and there was that strong link with the trade union movement and rugby league in those days. So, yeah, look, I could go on forever with some of the stories because there's some very funny stories around rugby league and particularly around City Newton as well. But I better give Mark a go, and I'm happy to have a bit. You know, if there's going to be a bit of a group talk, we can talk further about it. Yeah, thanks, Paul.
Talofa lava and kia ora. I just want to start, like Karl, a little bit return to the childhood, but I just want to share one thing. When I first started playing rugby league, I started playing with a guy called Neville White, whose father was Des White, and Des became our coach. A few years on, he became my mother's partner of 35 years, and sadly, Des passed away yesterday. So it was quite poignant that I was thinking about, what am I going to talk about tonight? And I was thinking about Des, who was a Ponsonby boy, ended up owning a New World supermarket in Papatoetoe, and was quite a complex sort of character. But if you followed the sort of stories of people like that, who were rugby league through and through, who were working class through and through, and much of the game in those days was an inner city game, but as our southern suburbs grew, as Ryan's book points out, you know, you've got that deep connection into the Māori and Pasifika world and into the jobs that Māori and Pasifika did. And earlier on, you go back to the Australian trade unionists who came and worked in our mines in places like the West Coast. And there's just such this brilliant mirroring, I guess, of our working class history in a way that this is a book with a rugby league title, but it's a social history that just connects this game that so many of us in the working class played and followed and are still tragics and follow even when the Warriors are bloody losing most of the time. So how did I get into that? Well, my dad was working at the Westfield Freezing Works and played rugby league and was a boxing champion. And we grew up in South Auckland, being born in Otahu, and growing up in Papatoetoe, where strong rugby league territory with schoolboy teams galore. You know, you'd play for a club and there wouldn't just be one team in that age group, there'd be 4 or 5. And in a place like Otahu, you'd play Otahu White and Otahu Blue and Otahu Convent. So the little St Joseph school that's still there in Otahu had its own team. And one of our greatest rugby league players called Mark Graham, I remember he was the same age as me, we played against him. So how did we get into it? Well, Dad was playing. We also went to the athletic club, and my brother and I were the fastest runners. So the rugby league coaches pretty quickly approached the parents and said, these boys have got to come and play rugby league. So we did. And I think it was just sort of that fact that we were growing up in a brand new sort of working class part of Papatoetoe, State Advances homes in the street that we grew up in, Middlemore Crescent, were state houses. And this was sort of the beginnings of those big suburbs, of working class suburbs. And it was quite natural, I think, to be growing up there, to be playing the game that was played by working class people. Many of the young guys that I played with, I showed Ryan before, there was an Auckland rep team photo of when I was about 10 or something, and there's 5 guys in that photo who went on to become some of our Kiwi greats. And they were the first generation of rugby league players who really entered into the more professional sort of world. Most players before that had not played for real money. They got a little bit, but the beginnings of this whole game, if you read Ryan's book, and I really strongly suggest that you do, goes back to the differences in the north of Britain, of England, between getting, was it 3 or 4 shillings a day, or is it a day or a week? A day, or 10 shillings when you had to take day off work to go and represent your province or your country. So rugby league was formed amongst working men who couldn't afford to take the time off versus the wealthier people who could afford to take time off and just get that 3 or 4 shillings versus 10 shillings. The game was the same, exactly the same rules, but one game you could get paid and the other one you couldn't. And so it was quite natural again that working class people couldn't afford to take time off work, were drawn into the northern game, and that came through to New Zealand. And one of the interesting things I found in your book, Ryan, was that I think it was either Auckland or was it the whole of New Zealand prior to World War I, had more rugby league teams than they did rugby union because of that payment thing. And then when you go through the book, you explore how the rugby union, which was very much dominated by the people who had power and control, it was a big class separation. They used the stuff that he talks about in the book. You can't play in the schools. And you had the head of the education department, or whatever they're called, sending down rules into the schools to say you will not have rugby league in the school. You had the council saying you will not play rugby league on public playing fields. It was incredibly interesting to read the book and see how that whole power structure worked against the working class, who dared to say we need to actually get reimbursed if we have to take time off work, because we can't afford to take time off work to play for our country or for our province. And I just think when you read this book and go deep into it, it's a really good explanation of the sort of class structures in New Zealand and how the powerful have always sort of used whatever tool they can against working people if they dare to go against the rules. And I'll share my bit of school experience, because we played rugby league from when we were 5 through to when we were 15 and became eligible for first 15 selection. And my brother, who's 2 years older than me, was quoted in the book. He was a pretty good bloody rugby player and a very, very good league player. So the younger brother's coming along to school looking and saying, why isn't this kid playing for us at the school? They didn't do the public humiliation trick with me. That 2 teachers got me into the room on my own and said, you know how university entrance is coming up next year, and you know how you can get it accredited and not have to sit the exam. You won't get it accredited, I'm telling you now, unless you start playing rugby for the school. And it was just as bald as that. And I sat there and said, you know, you were streamed A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H. And I knew how UE accrediting worked. They couldn't not accredit me because I was in the A class. And that would mean all the buggers below me, B, C, D. It would be very hard to sort of say, well, he's the only one in the A class who didn't get it. But, you know, half the B class, there's probably people in here who teachers who remember how it used to work. But that was the sort of bullying that went on. That was very popular with the rest of the guys in the school. But that sort of illustrates and comes through in the book the sort of power that teachers had to make you play that sport, that rugby union sport. And so for probably all of my life, I've had no, a bit stronger than you, but I really hated rugby because of that whole ethos of bullying and saying this is the sport that you will play, it is the sport of New Zealand. And it wasn't the sport in the community that we grew up in. And I think the other thing that comes through strongly in the book that really connected with me was just the deep connections that go into the Māori and Pasifika community, and the way in which really, really top rugby union players were sort of told you're not playing because you can't play against South Africa. And so Napier and people like that who went off and became league players because of that racist system that rugby just signed up to and agreed with and didn't care. And the way in which rugby was seen as part of authority and government, and you detail the Kingitanga and its reaction against the government, and therefore rugby league was something they felt comfortable. Rugby union was the establishment game. And again, if you get into the book and read it, you don't have to be a rugby league person to enjoy this book because it goes deeply into that. And then, of course, with Pacific people coming in and working in the jobs that nobody else would do, freezing works, etc., the attraction into playing their sport was very strong, which is probably why my dad played. Interestingly, just as an aside, that experience I had at high school, one of my neighbours who lived in the same street, he was he was made to trial for the first 15 as well, and he didn't get in. His name's James Luluwai. And he went on to be one of our greatest rugby league players ever. And my dad actually wasn't a Samoan Matai, but he behaved as if he was. And he told Mr. Luluwai, your boys are playing rugby league, because they were going to go and be rugby players otherwise. So, this thing around the Pacific community, and I watched my father say to other Samoans, get your kids to come and play rugby league. And he had that sort of, the boxing champion sort of mana. And so lots of kids in our neighbourhood, and etc., ended up playing rugby league. But I think, I have memories, and you will do too, Karl. Papataito used to go to, the whole club would go to Huntly for a day and have a tournament, Papataito versus Huntly, the coal mining, and then the next year Huntly would come to Papataito. And if you got in the Auckland reps as a schoolboy, they would do the same. Or everybody would go to Huntly and play the Waikato reps, and then the next year they would come up here. So there was those strong connections into places like Waikato and the sort of working class sort of communities that were built around the coal mines. When Ryan talked to us about the beginnings of this conversation back in 2012, where he was doing the piece on unions, I mentioned to him, I'm sure Karl did too, just that connection between trade unionists. And again, there's a really interesting sort of chapters in the book about the trade union movement and its connections. And many of the trade union leaders in New Zealand were strongly involved in the rugby league world. And Frank Barnard, who was the freezing workers president, his son was the same age as me. So there's Frank on the sideline when I was a kid. And I always remember Karl and his dad, because my brother Peter used to play against him. And boy, there was some pretty rugged games in those days. Nothing like it is today, but the rules weren't what they were then as they are now. In later years, I served on the New Zealand Rugby League board. It was just after I left Parliament, and rugby league was in a massive shambles. The government was unable to put any pressure on them to change their structures, which were corrupt and broke, because the government had stopped funding them. So there was no leverage to get the rugby league to change and alter its constitution. So they actually the Minister of Sport actually went and got the pokey trusts, who were still funding rugby league, to put the heat on and say, you're going to have a review. So they put Sir John Anderson or somebody in there, and he did this big review of rugby league. End result, I stood for the board and got elected in about 2009, and saw then how deeply embedded into community rugby league was. And we got quite an inspirational CEO, Jim Doyle, and we had a tagline, so more than just a game. And that reflected what rugby league clubs were to our communities. That it wasn't just a sport, it was a deeply embedded part of your life and your world. And it was interesting because I was doing some work with the Ministry of Pacific Island Affairs at the time, and they wanted to increase the early childhood education uptake from Māori and Pasifika children. So the ministry started to fund, at my suggestion, playgroups within rugby league clubs, because they'd started it in Papatoetoe and a few others. And I know clubs like Manukau were doing family violence programs with the men. And your book goes into that huge depth of involvement that people have, and importantly, the role of women is in there in the book, because so many of the clubs are massively dependent on the woman doing the voluntary work, and also the leadership positions. So I really would encourage you all to get a copy of the book, because it is so resonant with my life's experience, Karl's life's experience, and so many other people in the labour movement, to sort of see it captured in a way that's interesting and entertaining, and particularly if you're a rugby league tragic anyway, it helps. But there's really a good read there for you all. So well done, Ryan. I really want to congratulate you on what is a fantastic project.
Thank you, Mark. Time for questions if people are interested. We were just supposed to have the people from the Onehunga Book Club, the Onehunga Book Store, were to attend and offer the book at a discounted rate, but they don't seem to be here. Anybody got any questions of the speakers? Yep, I promise I will. Keith. Have a blast.
I haven't read the book again, but I tried to get to the Ellerslie launch at the Rugby League Club there, and certainly admire what you've put together and the connection and the social fabric of New Zealand. I'm a grassroots person myself, and got similar experiences there, but not in Auckland. In Wellington, actually. So my question is did you, in your interview process in writing the book, did you find a sense of enthusiasm of those you interviewed, and a sense of maybe relief in the story they wanted to tell that is often discredited in other circles, but you yourself being not a participant, but one with a academic background that maybe has provided a certain credibility to what you've written, as opposed to maybe, I don't like to use the word bullshit, but excuse my language, but there's a degree of fact in what you've said, and the people you've interviewed were, I guess, discriminated against. But at the other end of that came a hard person and culture, and where rugby league stands and continues to stand has not been overwhelmed by rugby union, if I could use that word. Yeah.
There's a few things to speak on there, but I think the hardness of rugby league people is definitely relative, because I think once it seems to me anyway, once you're in, the hardness breaks down, and many of these people have cried with me about these experiences because they've never been validated before. They've felt them, but they've never had them acknowledged in a way which I guess is laying it out in a way which the people who did it can understand it, can see it, and it's sort of in their language. But initially, there wasn't that initial. I mean, people were interested to chat to me, but I think a lot of people were like, "This is never going to fucking happen, bro." Like, Kevin Tamati said, "Rugby union people are everywhere. Your book will never see the light of day." That's what Kevin Tamati said. So that's the sense that a lot of those guys have, that it's still there, and they're still up against it, and So during the process, there wasn't that. I guess it took a while for a lot of the participants to see what I was producing and where it was coming from. But once it actually started to land out there, it's been incredibly gratifying, because definitely people have, like Graham West, an old Taranaki Kiwi, he came up to me and he was just like a little bit speechless, really, because his experience in provincial Taranaki was quite horrible, and he was just like, this is my life, man, thank you. So yeah, I mean, I can't really put a price on those sorts of comments, because that's the shit. So that's been amazing. But yeah, during the process, not really, because I think they were a bit like, they still had that thing of like, this is going to be blocked, someone's going to stop this, because they've never really been taken seriously. Even if you talk to some rugby union people, they're like, fucking get over it. It's just like, well, you don't get over getting fucking stood up in 13, 14-year-old kid in front of a school assembly. Like, that stuff stays with you. It does. So thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Ryan. Any other questions?
What are the schools like now?
Question, what are the schools like now?
My experience in recent times is that the school leader, and it sort of wanes a little bit, but there's still that deeply held prejudice is hung on there for many,
There's
many
still
years.
there's no school competition.
I know there are, but they play second fiddle to the rugby union by a big way. And the annual tournaments, unfortunately, have become scouting grounds for all the Aussie clubs. And so the book also gets into modern day experience, which is in itself quite scary, because we've got masses and masses of our young people and their families on the plane to Australia when they're 13 and 14. And I've experienced it in my family, my own grandson, much against my opinions. He wasted 18 months in an Australian school scholarship, but he was too small. And so he's back in New Zealand, thankfully. And I've had another nephew who came from Adelaide up to Brisbane, up to Sydney, and did a year's scholarship. So there are new challenges outlined in the book, but in New Zealand schools, I don't think it's changed. The others here know better than I, but I don't think it's changed dramatically. It's still a problem.
Any other questions? Sam? Yep, no.
Kind of like Ryan, I come from this not as a participant, but probably even more of an extent, because I'm not even really a consumer either of rugby. But I want to thank you, Ryan, firstly, for making me interested in the topic. I'm a history student, so that's partly why I have become, I guess, interested in the social history aspect of it. But anyway, my question was, and this might come out of ignorance, as I said, from my background, but I'm just thinking about the whole masculinity versus femininity kind of dynamics in rugby union, rugby league in New Zealand. And I was just wondering, are there any, at the moment, there are like female teams in rugby league in various places, and there's also obviously male teams. But are there any like mixed teams that are gaining more? Like, do they exist? I assume they exist, but are they becoming more prominent at all?
I don't think they really do exist, and I think a big part of that is it probably wouldn't be safe for a lot of, like, it's the body types are such that it's and the game is such that a mix. I don't know. So at a young junior grades, and then they'll separate.
Yes, I'm thinking 5 years, maybe 10 years from now. In a way, rugby has got itself stuck around a four-yearly cycle of a World Cup, and a whole lot of mangly sort of games that they play in the off season. And rugby league's sort of in a position where it could dominate. It could in fact become the more prevalent game played in both age group level and even in terms of public imagination. Do you see that happening in the next 5 years? And if so, what sort of shape might that take?
Well, I think what I ended up being the chair of the first Asia Pacific Confederation, which is essentially Australia, New Zealand, the Pacific. The Australians and the Brits dominate the game, much the same as there's dominant countries in rugby union. There's huge money involved. So you're shifting from a working class sport, which was played largely in an amateur sense, into huge dollars, largely controlled by the Australians. And the interesting thing is that model was busted by the Tongan rugby league players in Australia, saying we're going to put the money aside and play for the country we love. And it's completely changed the international game for rugby league for the better, but it wouldn't have happened without the bravery of those young guys who said, I'm going to play for Tonga. And then the Samoans stepped up and said, we're going to play for Samoa, and the Fijians. And that is very different to what's happening in rugby union, where the Pacific nations are completely crushed, and their players now go all around the world, become fully professional, and end up playing for Wales and Japan and goodness knows what. So it'll be interesting to see how it all works out. But it's all still dominated by the almighty dollar, which comes from broadcasting contracts. And anybody's guess as to what will happen. But it's still interesting to see that just a few young guys in Australia who decided to play for Tonga can completely change the world game. So that's sort of encouraging, really, isn't it? That there is still power in the way in which their players could sort of change the whole scene.
I sort of feel like the Australians brought that on themselves because they made a big thing of this concept of state of origin. Yeah. You know, it is about where you're from. And if you're going to talk about that as being the pinnacle, then let's have a buddy playing field which represents all the different places you can come from. They're not just Queensland and New South Wales.
Okay, everyone. Oh, sorry. Right.
Well, I think that's the challenge, because when you talk about rugby league, that's all right. I feel like a rock star out here. You have the game as it's played in New Zealand, but then so Australia and rugby union still has national integrity, whereas rugby league has almost no national integrity within the men's game, and so if rugby league was to take over, it would be the Australasian version of the game, and that's quite detrimental to many elements of the grassroots game here, and so that's not necessarily even a positive, if you know what I mean. Like, it's there's other issues I think that need to be addressed to sort of strengthen the to reconnect the local levels to the elite level here, instead of it being sort of you have to go. Like, the women's game still has that connectivity where the grassroots level can feed right up to the very elite level, whereas if you want to pursue anything like a dream in rugby league, you've got to leave the local game. And that's what the book says. That's where all the intangible, valuable stuff that's more than just a sport happens. But that's almost all bypassed, and it's the same with rugby union. They seem to be bypassing that and going through the development systems or through the school systems. And to speak to that school question earlier, I think it's still there. Like the fancy schools are still they have this rugby union heritage that they talk about, which they actively keep rugby league at arm's length. But yeah, other schools aren't like that because it's just normal people. But where the arrogance, where those centres of arrogance that those schools are, like fossilised arrogance that was brought here from England, which most of us try to escape from, that's still very much the thing. And rugby league is a four-letter word.
The interesting thing is that I was working in the Ministry of Pacific Island Affairs, it must have been about 8-9 years ago. I did a piece of research amongst our Pasifika secondary school students and talking about their aspirations. Sadly, most of the young men wanted to be professional rugby league players, and most of the young women wanted to be flight attendants. So the thing is that rugby league is a pathway out of poverty, much as you saw African American pathway out of poverty with sport. We're in that stage here, and that's a sad indictment really upon our society that that's the best option for many young people to see their way forward. Now, it's something like 0.4% of people who play rugby league make it into the NRL, and the average playing career is about 30 games, which is just over one season. So the dream for most is never ever realised, but it's a powerful force, and we just see so many of our young people and their families, Pasifika families and Māori families, up sticks, because you get scholarships to secondary schools all over Australia to play rugby league on the vain hope that you will get recruited by one of the rugby league clubs that those schools feed into. So it's an interesting sort of way in which the game has developed from where it came from to where it is, but it's still that economic driver that started the game in the first place is still there, but it's in a different form.
Right.
You finish what you're saying, Karl, and I'll answer those.
I was just going to make a comment on that professionalism aspect, because I went over to Brisbane as a 19-year-old to try and play rugby league there. See, and that was pre-Broncos. So the club scene in Brisbane in those days was huge. You had, Valleys that I played for, and Souths and Redcliffe and all these clubs. It was very, very strong. Now, I wasn't there when the Broncos came on board, but my understanding is much the same as it's happened here a bit, is that 10% of your players are taking 90% of the money. And the club scene in Brisbane dropped off with the advent of the Broncos, because everything is around the Broncos. So there's minuses and pluses in the professionalism. And like Mark said, having been in Australia in my working life a lot too, and you see that if you took the Pacific Islanders out of the NRL, there wouldn't be a lot left, Just the same as if you look at the national anthem, when the Australian team is standing there singing the national anthem, and I'm sitting there with my wife and I'm saying, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. They're all Pacific Islanders, or they're all ex-Kiwis, and so that, as Mark said, it's a way out of poverty for a lot of people. Take your kid to Australia. If they're any good if your daughter's any good at netball, maybe go to Australia. That's changing a bit, because the women's game of rugby league and rugby union, sometimes I've got to say I prefer watching it than the men's game in a lot of occasions. But Yeah, if one of your kids is any good at any of those sports, it's a way out of poverty for that family. And look, I know that through the Sonny Bill stuff. I mean, Sonny Bill's grandfather was a trade unionist and a good friend of mine. And people like Sonny Bill, he went to Australia when he was 13, I think. And, you know, for his family, and he's been very, despite what some people think of Sonny Bill, I happen to think that he's a fine person, a great role model in all sorts of ways. His family benefited from his extraordinary talents, and he's been very generous to his family. He's bought them all houses, he's financed them, he's done everything he could, but that was all from a skinny little lanky kid from Marist Rugby League who ended up in Australia and ended up a world superstar in both sports. So, you know, and if you read a book that came out recently called Comrade, you see Sonny Bill's grandfather on the front page. And there's all that link with rugby league. But anyway, I'll go back to that question.
And the study was not done at university, it was done just in my spare time. So I didn't have any issues with supervisors, but part of the reason why I did it in my spare time was because working at uni at that time, I was, just sort of writing in a more sort of, in the style that they expect there. It's sort of professional, it's managerial, and it's not very accessible. And so when I started to think about this topic about rugby league, doing it as a PhD, I just didn't really have the confidence to push against their expectations in that space, so I just did it my own way. But I'm going to go back, and hopefully it's a different experience, because now I can sort of got a way that I like to approach things rather than have to follow the sort of very dry approach that's often characteristic of history at uni. And the other question, Gaelic football and AFL, they have a lot of similarities, but I don't know about the connections, because a lot of the way I understand it is a lot of the football codes, they were sort of globalizing at the time that they were also codifying, and so they did have these vast differences, regional differences. And I think for a while there was a game called Christchurch Rules, where it was just football based on how they played it down there, just like Victoria Rules. But I don't know if there is a historic connection between those two codes. Is there a? There is? Okay.
They currently play tests. Is that right? Yeah, Aussie rules and Gaelic football. Gaelic will come over to Aussie and play a test. Oh, yeah. No one goes to it. Aussie rules is a derivative of Gaelic football.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, I was the ex-captain of the New Zealand Australian rules team in 1972. Can I finish on that note? I would like to tell a professional rugby league story, though, to everyone, because I was a professional for, I think it was half a game, where I played as I was in a trial with Manukau Rovers and the Whakapapa Rugby League Football Club Incorporated of the Bells and Friends. And I played again, I think it was Otahuhu. It wasn't Ellerslie, because I think we played them the week before. Played Otahuhu, came off the field and was completely dazed and battered in the changing rooms. And Cameron, the coach there, came up to me and slipped me this little package. It was very nice. It was one of those pay envelopes, those little brown pay envelopes. And in it was money. It was $14. It was, man, that was pretty good. We drew with that's your salary as a professional. So that's pretty good. So I got myself all ready, dressed up, and I'm heading out. And at the door was Cameron Bell standing at the door. And as I would go past, give me the money. I said, but that's my first pay packet. He says, yep, it's going on the bar. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Ryan, especially, for a wonderful book.